Hello, everybody. Today I'm going to talk about the 1997 novel by Don Delillo, Underworld. This is considered the magnum opus of Delillo's career, a highly acclaimed American writer who started publishing novels in the 1970s and continues to publish novels to this day. So, Underworld, where to begin with this book? It's a big book. There's a lot of big themes, a lot of big swings throughout this book, and it's I had to take a couple days after finally getting through it to kind of process the novel a little bit. So, what is Underworld all about? Would be the first question. So it's a novel about Cold War America starting in 1951, and the narrative goes up to into the mid 1990s. The narrative is told, it's experimental in terms of narrative, where a lot of the story is told, there's a lot of flashbacks and flash forwards, but mostly the story is told backwards, which is kind of hard to describe. So, for instance, the novel starts out in 1951. The prologue, which I'll talk more about, which is the famous baseball game between the New York Giants and the Brooklyn Dodgers in 1951. And then after that, we jump to the 1990s. Okay. And each section of the novel generally goes backwards. So we start in the 90s, then we kind of go back to the 80s, then the 70s, then into the 50s and 60s. So in for the most part the novel moves. We start in the past, then we move forward into the future, and then we track our way back to to 1951 again. So it's I think modern audiences are more used to this type of experimentation and narrative, and if you read the book, I think DeLillo guides you along fairly well with how the time functions in this novel, which is obviously also a big theme in this novel as well. So just a few things about the characters in this book. I should say that the book blends fictional characters with real historical characters throughout, which is effective for the most part. So our main character is Nick Shea, who we first meet. He is a he works in the waste management business. He's a high level executive, and he's a protagonist. And then his younger brother Matt Shea is also a supporting character through the book. And then the other main character is Clara Sachs, who is a highly acclaimed artist. And one of the big themes in the book is identity formation and how historical events, random events, change who we are, or they're always adding layers upon layers. How environment affects our identity is always doing that. For instance, I like to talk about the Nick Shea character, who we learn when we first meet him. He's middle aged. He seems like a fairly content husband in his marriage. He's got some problems, but for the most part, things are good. And then we learn, for instance, how Nick became who he was. And for instance, we learn when he grew up in New York City in the 1950s, and he was on the path to becoming kind of a criminal. Okay, and not to get too much into that, but he was sort of loosely involved with some criminal activity in the 1950s, which eventually blew up in his face and led him on a different trajectory in his life. Yet when we first meet older Nick, there's this thing in the book where he makes jokes like he's a mob boss, and like he'll order like hits on people and things like that, which we kind of write off. Oh, it's he's kind of making dad jokes and stuff like that. But then the more we learn about him, the more we learn how much of his identity that really is, and as we follow him through his various incarnations in his development, and I might talk more about that. And the same with Clara Sachs, who we first meet in the 1990s, where she's in her 70s and she's achieved a degree of fame as an artist. She's working on a project of painting old bomber planes in the desert as this public art project. And we see Clara Sachs. We get a There's a big section of the book that covers her life in 1974 in the 1970s, and then we see her in the early 1950s when she was an unhappy housewife in the 1950s in New York City as well. And Clara and Nick are connected which is in the book. I won't reveal that plot point, but there is this connection between them that kind of ties them together in some strange ways throughout the novel. So those are pretty much the main characters. There's a lot of minor characters, a lot of side characters appear throughout this book who are and the central event of the book as it starts out is the famous baseball game in 1951. The Brooklyn Dodgers and the New York Giants are playing for the pennant to win the National League, and the game famously ends on Bobby Thompson hitting a home run, and the Dodgers win the pennant, as the announcer famously says, and it was this huge dramatic moment to end the season. And DeLillo, as an overture to the novel, does a great job of setting the scene of this baseball game at this specific time in history. So on one level, we're following a young boy who catches the baseball that Bobby Thompson hit, or he manages to get the baseball, and the journey of that ball throughout the novel is a big plot point. There's also famous people at the game. We're with Frank Sinatra and Jackie Gleason and J. Edgar Hoover are at this game, and DeLillo is kind of shifting into their perspectives. Sinatra and Gleason are kind of trading jokes and jibes with each other throughout the game, and the game also occurred the day the Soviet Union detonated I think the hydrogen bomb on that day. So J. Edgar Hoover is there and head of the FBI, and he learns about the Soviets achieving that. So Cold War anxiety is a huge theme throughout the novel, and even the baseball game itself. Like DeLillo kind of speculates that sports provided this escape for people when the outside world was getting to be so terrifying, even in the midst of all the prosperity of the 1950s, you know, and things like that too. And at one point in the novel, a character speculates that in the 1950s, people just didn't go out, not like they did later in public parks and walking around, and that because people were afraid to go out in the 1950s, and even like speculation, was the stadium actually full at this baseball game? So you get some interesting theories like that throughout the book too. But it is a great, it's almost like a little novella in itself, that opening part at the Polo Grounds in New York City, and how that was a moment that affected all the characters in the novel in some ways, and things like that. So that's how the novel starts out, and I think now I'm just going to talk about some of the themes in the book, or some of the just things I wrote down as I was reading the book. I think one big part of it is nostalgia versus anti-nostalgia. I think those two things are in tension throughout the novel. For instance, like when you're writing about baseball, you know, it's very nostalgic. I mean, baseball is the most nostalgic sport out there, and how Delillo follows characters who are obsessed with baseball memorabilia and trying to hold on to some part of their youth, some part of themselves that they lost, and baseball really serving that nostalgic function, for people, mainly men. Men is Delillo is mainly concerned with men's relationship with baseball in the book as well. But I think there's also a lot of anti-nostalgia in the novel too, especially about the 1950s and 1960s, where we get a sense where everyday life was very hard in America, and much like today, much like then, you had to work a lot, you had to sacrifice a lot, you had to give up a lot to have even some degree of success in America. And there's even nods, there are black characters throughout the novel too that DeLillo follows, and you get the sense there's a lot in the novel about the racial divide in America, and then in the 1950s, 1960s, and I mean these things continue today, obviously, but how life was hard and difficult and often terrifying, especially when we talk about the Cold War stuff in the book. So there's a lot of tension there. Like there's one section at, I think it's at an advertising agency, and the men who work at this agency are just awful, and the way they treat women and the way they talk about women, and it's really you get a sense like life was not great for everybody, despite what we think about the past in the 50s and 60s. So, and I think even there's a big part of the book is set in 1974, mainly with Clara Sachs and and her involvement in the art scene, which once again is a time that we might romanticize that period in history. But I think there's a lot there in the novel that pushes against the how we think about the past, and how, especially as we get older, we we just tend to get more and more romantic about the past. So that's definitely a big part of the book. Yeah, so there's that. Decay and growth are big themes in the novel too. I think a lot of it just goes in the way that we follow the characters. How we see a lot of these characters when they were much younger, and they were completely different people than they were when they were older, and we see some, and then we see these characters get older, and they they lose, you start to lose things. So there's a real sadness throughout this book too about what it means to be young, and then what it means to get older. I mean, those are universal themes, those are older themes, but DeLillo really hits those pretty hard throughout the book. Like there's certain characters, we see them, like their physical deterioration, and some of just the real sadness there of just juxtaposing that who people were at one time and then who they are much later. And that goes a lot too with, there's a big theme of waste in the novel, and how civilization handles its waste in ways like that, and how it's like this cycle of dealing with all the excess and waste of living in a society, but also where rebirth and innovation comes from. So there is, and a lot of that has to do with how how a culture decides to handle waste, and things like that. So there's a lot in here about decay and growth, and I mentioned that art project that Clara Sachs is working on with the bomber planes, and then there's a scene earlier in the later in the book where we're actually on one of those planes when they're flying missions to during the Cold War to Russia and things like that. So how we take something that we discard and then through the artist can reinvent the way we think about these things. So there's a lot of that in the novel about decay and growth. There's a lot of existential angst throughout the book too. Spe- a lot of it poured on by the Cold War, as I mentioned at the baseball game, where you have this very exciting sports event, but kind of these terrifying things happening in the outside world. And I think as we follow these characters through the book, we see how their anxiousness about the world leads them to doing things like a lot of quixotic behavior or a lot of things that someone might normally do under normal times, and characters will act out in certain ways. A lot of it has to do with their own personal history and their own anxieties they have, but also the outside world and what's happening there. We see a lot of that with Nick, where he acts out at times against some of the pressures that lead him to maybe making some bad decisions. Nick's wife Marion is also a major character, a somewhat underserved character in the book, and we also follow her a bit and how the pressures of the world led her to making decisions. So there's a lot of that about how outside events, internal events drive behavior in people. And I feel like that really played out in the in some of the real historical characters in the book too. For instance, there's an interesting comparison between J. Edgar Hoover, who we follow quite a bit, who was head of the FBI, very powerful man for a long, long time, and the comedian Lenny Bruce, who we mainly focus on Lenny Bruce, who was the rebel stand-up comedian. We follow Lenny Bruce during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he is doing his comedy act as the crisis is unfolding in real time, and he's just delivering a kind of masterpiece of gallows humor, and I think the dichotomy between Hoover, who is presented as a man who like he repressed everything about him, and he was a very deeply paranoid man as well, and yet he was very powerful, and Delillo suggests that that was like Hoover's superpower in some way, like his ability to repress his desires, like Clyde Tolson is a character who was Hoover's companion throughout his life, and it suggested that they had this interesting relationship where it seemingly wasn't physical, but there was definitely this attraction between them. But that was Hoover's thing, though. Like any desire that you have, you don't act on it, you repress it. And it's interesting as compared with Lenny Bruce, who is someone who doesn't repress anything, who puts it. Lenny Bruce is throwing truth bombs all the time. He is putting his neuroses, his anxieties, all of his desires. He puts them out there to the world on stage, completely unfiltered. And I love the contrast between these two poles of American life, between like the repressive nature of institutions and the rebellious nature of the arts and things like that. So I really liked that part of the book. Other things I wrote down, I think West versus East is kind of a theme in the book where a lot of the book is set in New York City, and especially old New York in the 50s and 60s, which is where the Nick and Clara, where they're all from, and these characters all tend to migrate westward. The modern portions of the book are mainly set in the West, in Arizona and California, which once again this westward trajectory of America, where the East is just kind of this viewed as this like a place that is old and is, especially the people who left the city, I get the sense like it's a part of their past, and that's the way they view it. And the West is this modern, you know, where the new things are happening. Everything seems to be new in the West with sunshine. And once again, many novelists have wrote about that theme of East versus West, but DeLillo does it in this interesting modern way. And like even the baseball teams move west, famously Brooklyn moved to Los Angeles, and the New York Giants moved to San Francisco. So this idea of these economic currents, cultural currents in America too. There's a lot in here about the Texas highway killer who was a real thing of many killings along a highway in Texas in the 1980s. I actually went and watched a documentary about this from reading this book because I was curious to learn more. And there is a Netflix documentary on the highway killer, and DeLillo oddly like is really focused on this in one part of the book, and then just kind of lets it go. So yeah, but and nevertheless, there is some of those things there too. Let's see. So what else did I have here? And I think technology and dread. I think you get the sense the word DeLillo is. Actually get a little some references to the internet in the epilogue, and DeLillo seems ambivalent about technology, obviously with the internet and like Nick's young son in his 20s is spending most of his time in his room on the internet. And this is in the mid late 1990s. So I did notice some interesting foreshadowing there of today we hear all about young men who are just locked into the internet all day, doing what they do. So that was kind of an eerie little prediction there, but there is a sense that like we're entering into this new world now. Like, this is really DeLillo's requiem on probably his own past on in America that was disappearing. I mean, if you think about it, in 1951, if you were a 10-year-old kid in 1951 who, say, was following baseball, you would be in your 80s. So we are losing that generation who came of age in the mid-century and things like that too. So there's just a lot in here about a requiem for an era, and with all of its terrifying possibilities, but also some hope throughout the book too. I didn't latch onto this too much, but there is a religious current in this book too. For instance, young Nick is spends a lot of time with Jesuits at a reform school, and they have a huge influence on them. So there's Catholic iconography throughout this book as well. Like I said, that's not a theme I latched onto a lot, but it's definitely there and something to think about if I would ever go back and read this novel. But there is that that current to it as well. Yeah, yeah. So overall, my overall thoughts on the novel, I enjoyed reading it for the most part. I mean, there were some parts that were more engaging than others. I think I actually found the last sections of the book to be a little bit underwhelming, somewhat underwhelming, and maybe that was just me, but a long novel does tend to exhaust you a little bit. Maybe I was just getting, you do want to wrap it up, but I did find the final sections of the novel to be slightly underwhelming. Other sections of the novel, especially the section on the 50s and 60s where we're really jumping around through time and different characters, that was really cool. That was just great to read that. The baseball scene I talked about is really cool. So the New York City stuff in the 1970s is really interesting. Was a lot of fun to read as well. So there's Yeah, yeah. So there's overall, I really enjoyed the book, but like I said, it's a big book. There's a lot to think about as you're reading it. Thinking about the influence of this novel, and I was thinking about like, I think it has had a big influence on TV shows like Mad Men. I think in particular the Don Draper character is really similar to the Nick Shea character in this book, but also the way I think Madman is always was always commenting on the 60s and 70s and things like that. And I'm just trying to think of some other examples, but maybe a show like The Sopranos or The Wire, just these big overarching TV series that were trying to make these big statements about America as well. There hasn't been a film adaptation of Underworld. I looked and I see Netflix had the rights to it, and apparently they are. Who knows if it will happen, but I don't know if a miniseries would work for this novel necessarily. I felt like it would make the novel appear to be cheesy and really not that different from other stories that have covered similar terrain. I really think a 3 hour movie would be the best way to do this movie. Like a movie with a great budget, with a good director, I think would be one would there is a great movie I think in this book, but it would take I think you would have to make it powerful. I think you would just do it as one epic movie, and I think stretching it out in a mini series would just dilute the novel a little bit. But that's just me. That's my opinion. So, I've gone on long enough here. So that's yeah, my thoughts on Underworld by Don DeLillo. Thanks for watching, and I will see you later.